In today's note, we're going to look at interpreting and analyzing data. Again, before we get into that, we're going to want to do a little bit of review based on our last note on survey questions. So the new track at Crosley has been open for the past 3 months, and Mr. Blanchard wants us to design a survey that determines the uses and satisfaction of people using the track. Create 3 questions that could be used in the survey. So again, this could vary based on what types of questions you come up with, but because we want to know the uses and satisfaction of using the track, we need to come up with some specific types. So let's first talk about the satisfaction. I would say an easy question would be, how excited are you about the new track? And you could do it on a scale of 1, not very, to 10, which is very. So not very to very, or you could say super excited, just because there's a large range there. So that would be one question. Another question could be, quite simply, what do you use the track for? Right. So then we could have A, track and field, B, say soccer, C, cross, D, other, or E, none of the above. And finally, for 3, you could have an open-ended question. What improvements would you make to the track? So again, these questions can vary depending on whatever you're looking at or whatever you decide to come up with, but these are 3 possibilities that you could come up with. So because we're analyzing data today, we want to look at specific types of data, or at least categorize them. So we talked about our categorical and numerical data, but we're also looking at another type of classification, which is microdata and aggregate data. So microdata is the individual set of data from a single or about a single respondent. So this is the individual data from an individual person. So this is each person's individual responses. Right? So if you're doing a survey, the microdata would be each individual person's response. So if you had 12 people responding, you'd have 12 pieces of microdata. Aggregate data is data that are combined or summarized, so you can't see the microdata. So this could be where you take an average of the numbers, or you compile it all into a graph or a chart, so where you can't see the individual results. So these are the 2 types of data that you could be looking at when you are looking at data online in tables, on graphs, and so on. So in example 1, if we're looking at Stats Canada, and we're looking at the average domestic fares for Canada and top 10 major cities annually. So we're looking specifically at flights. So domestic fares, we're talking about flights. And we have our cities, and we have the annual years of when they did this survey, or they found these results. So first off, what type of data do we see? So looking at this, we should see aggregate data. And the reason we're seeing aggregate data is because if we're looking at domestic fares or flights in 10 cities, we are not looking specifically at the individual flight data or the fare data from each airplane or airline. Right? We're looking at the average, so we're seeing all of them into one value. So we're showing the averages, which is a good way of indicating that we're looking at aggregate data. So we're showing the averages, and we're looking at groups, right? Because we're looking at cities. So we're not looking at individuals, we're looking at groups. Another way we could categorize this is the type of data, is it primary or secondary? Well, because it's from Stats Canada, for Stats Canada itself, that's the primary data. They're the ones that collected it, but for us, it would be considered secondary data because we are taking someone else's data and we are going to come up with values or inferences from it. And finally, the other type of classification we could look at, categorical, because we're looking at cities, right? So we're grouping our variables by cities. So numerical or nominal, categorical and nominal, right? Because again, we're looking at cities. So there's three different ways that we can describe the data. We have it as aggregate, we have it for us for secondary, and it's categorical, and specifically nominal. So again, we do want to be aware of these terms for describing data. For B, what patterns do you see? Well, looking at these patterns, what we see is, or what we should see, if you go back up and pause and take a look at it, is that there is a general decrease from 2008 to 2009, as well as in Toronto, no change from 2011 to 2013. So if you look at the data, basically it's just what patterns do you see? How does the data fluctuate? How does it increase? Does it decrease? Does it not change? Does it increase in one area, decrease in another, and so on? So you're just looking at the data and seeing what does it tell you. What comparisons can you make? So we can make comparisons by comparing cities with the data. So we can compare the average fares by cities, because we have certain cities in here. We could look at provinces, right? We could look at the cities of provinces and compare that. We could look at region, so whether it's Eastern Canada, Central, or Western Canada. Or we can compare each city to Canada itself. So how does it compare to Canada as a whole? So again, it's just taking the idea of looking at the data and being able to compare it, or we're able to make inferences to all these different other variables: cities, provinces, regions, Canada. D, identify the independent and dependent variables. So the independent, what's not being affected, what's not changing, would be the cities. The cities aren't determined by the fares, right? The fares are determined based on the city. So that means our dependent would be our fares, which is in dollars. What type of sampling was used and where did you find this information? So usually on the things like Stats Canada, when they give you a table, they should give you a link to go in and figure out how the actual data is collected. So you would have to go find the table online, and there is information on how it's collected. So whether it's like a type of random sample or a survey, they would give you that information. So that is where you would have to go to find that. Example 2, so interpret the data using Fathom. So Fathom is a statistics software similar to Excel. We will be looking at it later in the course, but looking at these types of data or the different outputs, we want to look at some specific information. So looking at this, we're looking at music done by Avril Lavigne. So we want to see, first off, what type of data are these? And the type of data, if looking at these, I would argue that this is microdata. You're not looking at an average, you're looking at individual songs. So you can see where individual songs are listed or are played. So we can see each individual song. I would call it primary data because this is from a personal library. Right, it's data that I've collected or that you've collected. It's not on, you're not getting this information from someone else. You've collected this data. And there's a bunch of different outputs here. So there's different categories of data that we're looking at. So there is numerical data and there is categorical data as well. The numerical data, we're looking at things like song time, which is continuous. Right, so that would be numerical and categorical for song time, numerical and continuous. And for categorical, we're looking at genre, which is nominal. So we have categorical and nominal. You could look at bit rate over here. So bit rate would be numerical but discrete, because it's specifically one bit rate or the other. It doesn't change. Time we know is continuous. Genres we know are a category. So what information is given about each song? So looking at what has been listed, we have the genres, we have the time, we have the file size, we have the name of songs, we have the artist, we have the bit rate of the files, right? So all of this is just looking at our categories and seeing, okay, what is given to us? So all of this can just be gathered by reading our data. See, what kind of story does the time histogram tell you? So it's not so much a story, but what does the data tell you? So looking at the data, we should see the most common length of time is 210 seconds to 230 seconds. So that interval there, because again, it's the highest bar in our histogram, and so we can easily tell that. And finally, are each of the artist genres equally distributed in terms of bit rates? So if we look at our our bar graphs, we would see that no, they're not equally distributed because the bars aren't even. We just say no. So again, it's just the whole idea of being able to look at graphs